Hi, I'm Amanda Florczykowski. As a subscriber, you know that most of my blog posts go out via email. Today I thought we would do something a little bit differently and actually make a video, and the reason is because it meets my objective, which is getting the word out about child sex trafficking in America the fastest to the most amount of people using the best medium. And so I'll go ahead and make it shareable for you. I just finished up publishing Unraveled, Mothering Fiercely in a World Full of Fears. And this became a bestseller essentially overnight on Amazon. It hit #1 in 3 categories. It became the #1 new release in 5 more categories and holding strong. And it also beat out New York Times bestsellers like Bob Goff and Timothy Keller. And I believe that's essentially because we live in a culture where this message is timely. And I believe that God has a genuine, because of his word, love for children and desires that we as the church become the first line of defense and the response team to defend those who cannot protect themselves. So we're actually right in the middle of this series called Unraveled on AmandaFlorczykowski.com. I won't always talk about child trafficking in America, but for right now, like I said, we're right in the middle of that series. So I wanted to briefly address one thing on today's blog post, and that is, I have a hair in my mouth or something. And that is something that came up again this week. It has shown up in the life of what is now my ministry several times. And it showed up again this week. I have been asked to be a keynote speaker, and the event planner told my team that they wanted to be sure and let me know that there are people in the audience who have had adverse reactions to speakers because they do not believe, and they cannot believe that somebody else would say that child trafficking is happening in their community. And I want to first say I empathize. 3.5 years ago, this would have been something that maybe would have been hard for me to wrap my head around. I had always heard about child sex trafficking as happening overseas, and I knew that I could have an effect on it, but I did not know that it happened here in America, and child sex trafficking could have an effect on me and my family. Obviously, being a subscriber, you know my story. It, in a very real way, intersected my life when a child sex trafficker, a female who is part of a child sex trafficking ring of 4 individuals, took my daughter from my arms. Throughout our entire interaction, the only time that she distanced herself from me was after she had my daughter in her arms. And she also told my daughter to parrot, say bye-bye to mommy. It is another blog post for another day, or the book, what happened and what I believe would happen. But for today, I just want to address this one topic, that this myth, essentially, that it's not happening in our backyards. However, I don't want to address it from an experiential perspective. I don't want to say to you, well, this happened to me, so it could happen to you. And while that is part of it, it's not the full picture. I want to come to the discussion with facts and with concrete evidence, so that you can walk away feeling secure in this stance, and also empowered by the information you have. I don't believe that my daughter was the only vulnerable one in the grocery store that day. I believe that she was targeted at 2.5 because I was vulnerable. I didn't know everything there was to know. And truth be told, it was probably a little bit easier for me to shelve this topic than it was to really research and address it. When it intersected my life sovereignly by God's divine plan, I did begin researching, as difficult as it was. I've spent the last 3.5 years up to my elbows in research. And it was remarkable because once I had began researching this topic, I put out a brief warning on social regarding my daughter's story. And that story, it's estimated today, has been seen by over 60 million people worldwide. An astronomical number. It was shared on one social media site alone over 170,000 times before it bled into print media and online media, televised media, and so on and so forth. But what God sovereignly did at the time, it was terrifying, but what he sovereignly did is that overnight I had connections to researchers and people of academia and founders and victims and people who had worked in the industry, other moms who had similar stories, advocates. I mean, all of these resources were at my fingertips. And so I was able to capitalize on that and essentially start this journey of researching the real data. I can tell you whether the organization is Christian or the expert is non-religious, all of them will tell you in 2019 unequivocally that right now in your communities, sex trafficking is happening. And all of us would venture to say that if you're not identifying that child trafficking is happening, it's simply because we're turning a blind eye to it, because it sincerely is. The reality is that this industry is a $32 billion a year industry. That number seems grandiose and it's hard to really wrap our heads around. But what you need to know as a parent is that child sex trafficking in 2016, when my story happened, child sex trafficking rivaled the international arms dealing trade. Today, it is poised to surpass the number one international crime of drug trafficking. Actually, child trafficking and human trafficking is more attractive to a trafficker because drugs can be used one time, but a child can be used repetitively for income. So a lot of drug traffickers are evolving their business to meet because they recognize the financial gain of selling a child versus drugs. Still, child trafficking, if you were to take just that out of that statistic and just focus on child trafficking, currently child trafficking is making more revenue annually than the MLB, the NHL, the NBA, and the NFL combined. Those 4 sports leagues are not bringing in as much annual revenue as child trafficking is. It's astronomical. We're talking about a business that rivals big oil. So my husband and I have started ministries and things like that, but our background essentially as now business owners for over 12 years together, and then entrepreneurial partnerships throughout, is really in business. Our understanding is business. And so when I started researching, I looked at this as a business. One of the things that I would encourage every parent to do who questions, is this really what I think it is? Is this really happening in my community? Is to look at it from a very logical perspective. To a trafficker, this is not an atrocity. And so you and I cannot look at it as simply an atrocity. It's horrid and it absolutely can be defined as that. But it is not just an atrocity. This is a business, and that's how a trafficker sees it. It's evolving. Traffickers understand they have to be innovative, and anything that can be sold, anything that can be bought can be sold. And so they identify that there's a market for it and there is demand for it. As we see, $32 billion a year, more revenue than these 4 leagues. If we are, and this is just what we know about, so if we're seeing this much revenue come in, there's a demand for it. If you look at the statistics, America is the number 1 importer and exporter of child pornography. Our country also is one of the top 3 countries in the world for the sex trade, for child sex trafficking. We actually compete with Mexico and the Philippines. It's absolutely devastating that it is happening right here, and that we cannot ignore. It's not just happening in big cities, it's happening everywhere. And the reason I know that is not just the business statistics of it, it's also the spiritual side of it. When we as believers say, this absolutely is not happening in my community, what we're essentially saying is that sin knows boundaries, and that's not biblical. Sin doesn't know boundaries. The enemy doesn't know boundaries. And the moment we step back as a church and say, the devil doesn't play here, he plays down the street, we open ourselves up for greater destruction. We have to recognize that this is happening in our communities. We do have to say to ourselves, this is disgusting, it is dark, it is not something that I like to look at, but we are the answer. We are the answer. The very people whose spirits are so sensitive and don't want to identify this, We are the answer, the church. I want to leave that with you today. I want to thank you for your time. Take care. AmandaFlorczykowski.com.